June 3, 1983, Charles Bronson sat alone in his office, staring at a stack of financial documents that his accountant had placed on his desk that morning. The numbers did not make sense. Over 3 years, nearly $800,000 had been transferred from his accounts through a series of complex transactions, all authorized by one person, his manager, his friend, a man named Edward Garfield, who had been by his side for 22 years. Charles picked up the phone and called his lawyer. "Get Edward in my office today and call the bank. I want every transaction he authorized in the last 5 years reviewed. What happened over the next 6 hours destroyed a friendship that had survived Hollywood's most brutal decades. And what Charles did afterward, the choice he made about how to handle the betrayal, revealed something profound about who he was and what loyalty really meant to him. This is the untold story of the day Charles Bronson discovered his best friend had stolen from him, and why his response was the most surprising thing anyone who knew him had ever witnessed. Edward Garfield had been more than Charles Bronson's manager. He would have been his anchor in Hollywood, his guide through the labyrinth of studio deals and contracts and industry politics. Charles was a simple man. He grew up in coal mines. He fought in wars. He understood physical work and honest pay, but Hollywood was not simple. Hollywood was complicated, deceptive, full of traps for people who did not understand the rules. Edward had understood the rules. He would grown up in Beverly Hills, gone to USC, spent his 20s working in talent agencies before striking out on his own. He was charming, brilliant, and utterly fluent in the language of Hollywood power. They would met in 1961, when Charles was still struggling for recognition, still taking whatever roles he could find. Edward had approached him after a screening, claiming he saw something special, something that would eventually make Charles a star. "You have got something nobody else in this industry has," Edward had told him. "You have got authenticity. Audiences are going to feel that. Eventually, we just have to be patient." Edward had been right, and the patience had paid off. Through the Rat Pack years, through the Italian films, through the breakthrough of the Magnificent Seven, and ultimately, Death Wish. Edward had been there for every step, negotiating contracts, managing finances, protecting Charles's interests, or so Charles had believed. The accountant who discovered the discrepancies was a woman named Helen Torres, hired 6 months earlier after Charles's previous accountant retired. Helen was thorough, methodical, the kind of person who noticed when numbers that should add up did not. She would come to Charles's office that morning looking uncomfortable. "Bronson, I have found some irregularities in your accounts. I want to make sure I am not missing something before I draw conclusions." Charles had looked at the documents she placed before him. Complex financial maneuvers, shell companies, consulting fees paid to entities that did not appear to do any actual work, investment accounts that had been created and liquidated with funds that never returned. "Who authorized these transactions?" Charles had asked, his voice dangerously quiet. "All of them were authorized by Mr. Garfield as your financial manager of record." Charles had studied the documents for a long time. Then he would ask Helen to leave and sat alone with the evidence of his best friend's betrayal. He was not shocked. That is what haunted him most afterward. He was not shocked, because looking back, the signs had been there. Edward's increasingly lavish lifestyle, the new house in Malibu, the cars, the vacations, the wife's jewelry, none of it explicable on a manager's commission alone. Charles had noticed, but he would told himself there were explanations. Family money, smart investments, good fortune. He would trusted Edward, and trust had made him blind. By the time Edward arrived at Charles's office that afternoon, Charles had his lawyer present, and a complete analysis of the financial discrepancies laid out on the conference table. Edward walked in, smiling. "Charlie, what is the emergency?" Your assistant sounded worried. He stopped when he saw Charles's face, and the documents, and the lawyer. "Sit down, Edward." Edward sat. His smile was gone. "My new accountant has been reviewing the accounts," Charles said, his voice completely flat. "She found some interesting transactions. I would like you to explain them." Edward looked at the documents. Charles watched his face cycle through emotions, fear, calculation, and finally, a kind of resigned defeat. "Charlie, I can explain." "Then explain." Silence. "How much?" Charles asked. Edward closed his eyes. "I do not know exactly. Estimate, maybe 800,000. Over the years." Charles absorbed this. His expression did not change. "Why?" And that is when something unexpected happened. Edward Garfield, one of Hollywood's swiftest operators, broke down, not a calculated display of remorse. Genuine collapse, his face crumbling, tears spilling, hands shaking. "I got in over my head," Edward said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Gambling, debts. I borrowed from some people I should not have borrowed from, and then I needed more to pay back the first debt and more to cover the second, and it kept going. I kept telling myself I would pay it back, that I would figure out a way to return it before you ever found out, but you did not." "No, I did not." Charles sat very still. 22 years, Edward. 22 years I trusted you with everything. My money, my contracts, my career. 22 years, I know. Is there anything else I do not know about? Any other accounts? Any other transactions? "No, I swear to God, Charlie, that is everything." Charles looked at his lawyer. "Can you give us a moment?" The lawyer hesitated. His was exactly the kind of conversation attorneys advised clients not to have privately, but the look on Charles's face made him nod and leave the room. Now it was just the two of them, Charles and Edward, friends for 22 years, one of them the thief. "You have children," Charles said. It was not a question. 3, you know that. You came to their christenings. I know. What happens to them if I go to the police? Edward's hands were shaking harder now. "Charlie, please. I will pay it back. Everything. With interest. I will sell the house, the cars, everything. Please do not." "What happens to your children?" Charles repeated. "Their father goes to prison. They grow up without—" Edward could not finish. Charles stood up and walked to the window. He looked out at the Los Angeles skyline for a long moment. When he turned back, his voice was quiet, but absolute. "Here is what is going to happen. You are fired. Today, you will never work as a manager in this industry again. I will make sure of that. You will liquidate the house in Malibu and the vacation property and whatever else you have bought with my money, and will pay back every dollar with interest through my lawyer over the next 3 years. Edward was nodding frantically. Yes, anything. I'm not finished. You will not go to prison. Not because you deserve protection, but because your children do not deserve to grow up without their father because of your stupidity. But understand this, if you ever steal from anyone else, if I ever hear your name associated with financial misconduct again, I will personally hand everything I have to the district attorney. Every document, every transaction record, everything. Do you understand? Yes, I understand. And Edward, Charles's voice dropped even lower. We are done. After today, I never want to see you or speak to you again. What you took was not just money. You took 22 years of trust. You can repay the money. You can never repay that. Edward was sobbing now. Charlie, I am so sorry. I know sorry does not mean anything, but I am. I am so sorry. Charles walked to the door and opened it. Get out. Edward walked out, still crying. Charles watched him go, his face completely expressionless. His lawyer came back in immediately. "Charles, I strongly advise you to file a police report. What he did is criminal. No police. But he will repay the money. Get the agreement in writing. Make it legally binding. But no police." The lawyer shook his head, clearly unhappy. "Charles, this is a significant amount of money, and without criminal charges, there is no real guarantee. Write the agreement. Make it airtight. If he misses a single payment, then we talk about police, but not before." After the lawyer left, Charles sat alone in his office for almost 2 hours. His assistant, aware that something major had happened, brought him coffee and left him alone. Charles did not touch the coffee. He just sat. He was thinking about 1961, about the young manager who would approached him after a screening and told him he had something special, about the early years when Edward had worked tirelessly for almost nothing, believing in Charles before Hollywood did, about all the dinners, the phone calls, the golf games, the celebrations of every success. 22 years, and it had ended in an hour. What Charles felt was not just anger, it was grief. The death of a friendship, sudden and irrevocable. And underneath the grief, something else, the nagging question he could not escape. Had Edward ever really been his friend, or had it always been about the money? He never found an answer. That uncertainty, that inability to know whether the friendship had been real, haunted him for years. In 1985, Edward made his first repayment, a check for $150,000. Charles did not open the envelope himself. He had his new manager handle it. The repayments continued on schedule. True to his word, Edward sold properties, liquidated assets, and returned every dollar over the 3-year period. By 1986, the debt was paid in full. Charles received a final letter from Edward with the last payment. He never opened it. He had his lawyer confirm the amount was correct, then filed it away. Jill Ireland, who had known Edward socially for years, asked Charles once why he had not pressed charges. "Because I know what it is like to be desperate," Charles said. "I know what it is like to make terrible decisions, because you are scared and you do not see a way out. I grew up with nothing. I understand desperation, but he stole from you, from us, yes. And he will have to live with that, carry that, a punishment enough. You do not believe that?" Charles was quiet for a moment. "No, I do not. But his kids do not deserve a father in prison, and I am not willing to punish them for his crimes." Jill studied him. "Are you sure you are not just protecting yourself from the anger, from having to face what he did?" "Maybe," Charles admitted. "Maybe that is part of it. It was the most honest thing he said about the incident." Years later, a therapist he briefly saw at Jill's urging suggested that Charles's refusal to prosecute was a way of controlling his grief over the betrayal. Fuffle sent Edward to prison. It became real. The friendship was definitively revealed as a lie. At letting Edward go quietly, Charles could maintain some ambiguity. He could still choose to believe, if he wanted, that somewhere beneath the theft, the friendship had been real. He never spoke to Edward again, but he did not stop thinking about him. About what had been real and what had not. About 22 years of memories, now contaminated by doubt. In 1994, Charles learned through a mutual acquaintance that Edward had died of a heart attack. He was 62 years old. Charles said nothing when he heard. He just nodded, dismissed the messenger, and went back to what he was doing. That night, alone, he took out the unopened letter Edward had sent with his final payment. He would kept it all those years, never opened it, never thrown it away. He sat with it for a long time. Then he put it back in the drawer without opening it. It was still there when Charles died in 2003. His daughter Katrina found it while going through his belongings. "Should I open it?" she asked Charles's lawyer. "That is entirely up to you." Katrina held the envelope for a long time. Then she opened it. The letter was brief. In Edward Garfield's handwriting, "Dear Charlie, the debt is paid. I know money cannot repay what I actually took from you. I know you will never trust me again, and you are right not to. But I want you to know that everything before the stealing was real. The friendship was real. I was a weak man who made terrible choices, but I was also your friend, and the years we spent working together were the best of my professional life. I am sorry I ruined it. I am sorry I could not be better. I hope someday you can find a small corner of your heart to believe that the good years were genuine, even if the end was not. I miss you, Ed." Katrina read the letter twice, then folded it carefully. "What do you want to do with it?" the lawyer asked. "I think my father kept it, 'cause part of him needed to know," Katrina said quietly. "Part of him hoped Edward would say exactly this, that it was real, that the friendship had mattered." She paused. "I think he kept it because he wanted to open it when he was ready. But he was never ready. He was too hurt." She placed the letter back in the envelope. "I'm going to keep it as a reminder that grief and anger and love can all exist at the same time, even towards someone who betrayed you." The story of Charles Bronson and Edward Garfield became known in Hollywood circles through the years, told quietly among managers and agents as a cautionary tale. Not about Charles's response, which most considered extraordinarily merciful, but about the destruction of trust and how even the most loyal-seeming relationships could harbor hidden betrayals. But those who knew Charles best saw a different lesson in the story. Not a cautionary tale, but a character study. The way Charles had handled the betrayal, the decision not to prosecute, the allowance of repayment, the complete but quiet severing of the relationship, said everything about who he was. He did not perform his anger. He did not make Edward's humiliation public. He did not seek revenge beyond making Edward whole, his accounts. He simply removed Edward from his life with surgical precision and moved forward. Not because he forgave easily. He did not. The unopened letter proved that. Years of keeping it sealed, unable to face the words inside. That was the true measure of how deeply the betrayal had cut. But because he understood that some wounds did not need to be broadcast to be real, some devastations were private. And Charles Bronson, who would spend his career portraying public displays of strength, understood better than anyone that the deepest strength was often the quietest. He would fired his best friend. He would taken back his money. He would never spoken to the man again, and he would kept the letter. Because some part of him, some stubborn, grief-stricken part, needed to believe that 22 years of friendship had been worth something, even if it had ended in theft. Even if the trust was gone forever. June 3, 1993, Charles Bronson discovered his best friend had stolen $800,000 from him. June 3, 1993, Charles Bronson chose mercy over revenge and grief over anger. June 3, 1983, Charles Bronson sat alone in his office, staring at documents that proved betrayal, and made a decision that revealed more about his character than any role he would ever play. He could have destroyed Edward Garfield, could have sent him to prison, publicized the theft. In short, he never worked again. Instead, he took his money back, ended the friendship quietly, and kept a letter unopened for 20 years, not because he was weak, because he understood something most people do not. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is refuse to let someone's worst moment define everything that came before it, even when it hurts. Especially when it hurts. That is the real Charles Bronson. Not the vigilante of Death Wish, not the tough guy of 100 action films. Just a man who had been betrayed by his best friend and chose to carry that pain privately, with dignity, until the day he died.